Secretary King. It is such a pleasure to be engaging in this conversation with you. I remember the first day, the first time I learned about who you were and your story. And your story was, it was compelling to me. I read it, but then I saw you. We met in Dallas. You were at an event. And during the event, you got an opportunity to share a little bit about your story. And so your story impacted me in a different way. And so I'm hopeful that if you share a little bit about your story this morning, the folks that are listening, it could possibly, even if they've heard it more than one time, it could impact them and the work that they're doing in a different way, especially as our conversation today is centered around going back to school and equity in schools, a conversation that's running rampant throughout our globe right now. And so, can we start our conversation by just you telling a little bit about your story?
Sure, sure. Well, my story is really about schools and the difference that teachers can make in the lives of students. I grew up in New York City, in Brooklyn. Both my parents were New York City public school educators. My father was African American, grew up in a very segregated New York City just after the turn of the 20th century. My mom was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico, and came to New York City as a kid, learned English in the New York City schools. And both of them committed their lives to education. They're both teachers, and my father was an administrator. My mom was a school counselor. She's actually a school counselor in my elementary school. It was very well behaved in elementary school. And we talked about school all the time in our house, but they couldn't have known the difference that uh, New York City schools would make in my life. They both passed away when I was a kid. My mom when I was 8 in October of fourth grade, and then my dad had undiagnosed Alzheimer's. So it was just the two of us, and he got more and more sick over time, and then he passed away when I was 12. And I always tell folks the thing that saved me, the reason I'm alive today, the reason I'm not in prison today, is because I had a series of amazing New York City public school teachers who made school a place that was safe and supportive and nurturing. Um, I had one teacher in particular, Mr. Osterwile, who was my teacher in fourth, fifth, sixth grade. He looped with us, which is very unusual in New York City public schools at the time. Uh, but his classroom was amazing. We read the New York Times every day, fourth, fifth, sixth grade. We did productions of Midsummer Night's Dream and Alice in Wonderland. He took us to the ballet and to the museum. He was the kind of teacher where when you finished a book, he was there with the next. When you finished a math problem, he was there with another. It was a little more challenging. And his classroom was this place where I could be a kid when I couldn't be a kid at home. And it made all the difference for me. It really was the source of just hope in my life during that period. I'm still in touch with Mr. Osterwile. And had the blessing of having him spend time with my kids. He's
Yeah.
just a wonderful, wonderful man. He came to my swearing in as secretary, and I was able to talk about the role he played in my life. So um, he made a huge difference. And then I just had this series of teachers who, they could have looked at me and said, here is a African American, Latino male student, family in crisis. What chance does he have? And
Right.
they could have given up on me, but I'm very blessed that they didn't, that they invested in me.
Mm.
And and it wasn't a straight line. I after my dad passed, I moved around different family members, different schools. I always loved school on the academic side, but by the time I was a teenager, like a lot of teenagers who've experienced trauma, I was really angry, and I got in trouble a lot. And I actually got kicked out of high school. I always tell folks I'm the first U.S. Secretary of Education who've been kicked out of high school. Uh, but that is also an important part of my story because there were folks in my life who were willing to give me a second chance, who were willing to see me as more than the sum of my mistakes. and who were willing to have more faith in me than I had in myself, and their willingness to invest in me um, really put me on the path to the life I've had. So I was very lucky. There were teachers and a school counselor and family members and mentors who gave me that second chance, supported me, and really made it possible for me to become a teacher and a principal and so forth.
Yeah. So you know the work of secondary principal. You served in that role. Um, we bring passion and compassion and as much energy as possible to our roles, right? It's backbreaking work.
Mm-hmm.
And when I think about all of the things that we have to do, coming to the table with a solutions oriented mindset of everything that
Mm-hmm.
we do, the daily operations to execute a 5-star learning experience for students is incredibly challenging,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but it has to be done. You know, I serve 56% Hispanic, 39% Black. So the numbers are telling for the kind of engagement and the level of data driven activity. You've got to engage them in one on one conversations and feedback and instructional rounds, and it goes on and on and on, right? If you want to be effective, if you want to
Yes.
not only move the needle, but to teach the life skills and the thought
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
processing and all of that. And so last month, I remember listening in on a conversation. It was an inaugural conversation you were having with a reporter, and I think it was an effort from, it was called the Racial Divide. And you
Mm-hmm.
guys had a conversation around equity in schools.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciated how you pointed out 3 areas of school equity. You mentioned, you called them observations, and you said the first one was we give the least to the students who need the most. The second one you described as our schools being deeply segregated by class and by race. Although many would argue that Brown versus Board of Education dismantled segregation, but you said no. Our schools are deeply segregated
That's
now
right.
in 2020, August
That's right.
2020. And then you challenged us to think about um, racism in American society. You challenged us around the idea of what are we doing as educators to push or help our white counterparts, our students, their parents, the school community that are white, to own or appreciate their role in racism in America. And so I thought immediately I turned the mirror on myself to think, okay, how are we ultimately holding them accountable for their need to be anti racist? Right. And so I thought it was fitting to ask the question from that lens of a secondary principal to me and to other principals across the country. How do we do that? Because we're so hard pressed, Secretary King, to move the needle.
Mm-hmm.
We're so hard pressed with many things, social and emotional support,
Mm-hmm.
building relationships with parents. You know, the layers of things as campus leaders and administrators and teachers, our plate is so full.
Mm-hmm.
How then do we add on to that plate and do so effectively? Because something's got to give, right? If we're not effective, if we're giving 110% at school, what's
Mm-hmm.
left for our children at home? So
Mm-hmm.
this question is not about balance, but how do we do that and progress forward in a very smart way and to be effective? Talk about
Yeah.
it. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, it's a huge challenge, but I would say we can't afford not to, right?
agreed.
We can't afford not to take on dismantling systemic racism and address
Agreed.
the consequences of inequity in our schools.
Thanks.
Often point out to folks that majority of the kids in the nation's public schools are kids of color.
Hmm.
Majority of the kids in the nation's public schools are eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So if we fail to educate students of color and low income students, we have no future as a society. Our economy has no future, our democracy has no future. So the stakes mean that we have to be engaged in that work. I do think there are ways to uh, leverage the resources that we have at our disposal currently in smarter ways. So, a few examples. One is thinking about curriculum. And do kids have the opportunity to find windows and mirrors in the curriculum? Right? Do they have opportunities to see themselves reflected
Right.
and also to see worlds beyond their own? And what we know is that too often students of color do not see themselves reflected. They aren't getting the opportunity to read books by authors of color. They aren't reading books that center characters who are people of color. They aren't seeing themselves reflected in the history that we teach, both the realities of systemic oppression in American history, but also examples of Black excellence and Latino excellence and Asian American excellence and all the contributions that have helped to build this country. And so that's an opportunity, and it's an opportunity for students of color, but it's also an opportunity for white students because they also need to have those windows right onto experiences different from their own. Staffing, we, as I said, a majority of our kids are kids of color, but only 18% of our teachers are teachers of color. We have not been systematic enough as a country about building pipelines of diverse teachers. Um, Black and Latino teachers, bilingual teachers, right? And we have not only not done a good job on the pipeline side, we also haven't done a good job on the retention side. In many communities, attrition for teachers of color is higher than the attrition rate for white teachers, in part because people are experiencing all kinds of what I would describe as an almost invisible tax as teachers of color, where they're carrying um, the responsibility for addressing issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in schools, and that's not fair, right? That's not the responsibility of educators of color alone. That's everybody's responsibility. But making decisions about staffing is an opportunity to diversify the adults in front of kids, and again, matters for kids of color. We have good research evidence that for students of color, having a teacher of color increases their likelihood of graduating from high school and going on to college. But I also think it matters for white kids to see teachers and leaders of color in their schools and communities. So that's another place where we can shift our focus. We also, you mentioned earlier data disaggregation. We need to ask, who's in the advanced placement courses, who's in the algebra class in eighth grade, who's in the advanced work class, who's in the robotics club, who's in the debate club, right? What are we doing to make sure that the full range of opportunities are available to all kids in the building? How are we thinking about summer and what students are doing during the summer? When I was a middle school principal, we had someone on staff who had, as part of her job, working with families to make sure that every kid was meaningfully engaged in a productive summer activity. And it was very labor intensive, figuring out, helping families figure out camps and academic programs and uh, camping opportunities and all kinds of adventures for kids. But it was so valuable to make sure that summer wasn't a time of kind of loss and isolation, but rather a time of acceleration and enrichment. And so, those are some of the things. I guess what I'd say is this is part of our charge. Um, being anti-racist isn't an extra; it is fundamental to our
Absolutely.
work.
Absolutely. What I hear you saying is the charge does not require us to add layers of work to, but to really look at what we're already doing and somewhat tweak,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult to do that without having collaborative conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Just building a library and focusing some of the silent sustained reading time on becoming more familiar with Black and Latina, that it's not happening the way it should be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that perhaps our attention is on the wrong thing. But again, this conversation will hopefully build that confidence, because the first thing that we hear as principals or school support staff is, uh, another thing to do.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
that's
That's real.
it
That's
is.
real.
It
Yeah,
is that facts.
yeah.
And my goal with this conversation is to say, actually, no, no. And it's, we hear it, but then on the left side, we're bombarded with other to do
Sure, sure.
of things to do. And so thinking about the digital divide,
Hmm.
I've got colleagues across the state, across the country, who are starting at a deficit.
Hmm.
We have this amount of number of students and this number of devices.
Hmm.
I, I'm charged with, when I'm in these conversations, with keeping people encouraged to say, hey, listen, let's try this, let's try that, let's try this. I'm wondering if you can weigh in on that particular topic of this. It's digital divide. Because, thank you, computer, it's 9 o'clock. Um, the digital divide is real. It is indeed
Yeah.
real. And some are worried. How do we continue the learning at a high level, preparing students for college and careers? We can't spend lots of time on catch up. We just do that. If we do that, we're going to find ourselves in kind of this loop, right? This
Hmm.
loop of,
Hmm.
how do we get back on grade level? We just can't do it. So weigh in on that, this digital divide, and offer some insight perhaps that would help, principals and campus leaders.
Yeah. Well, look, this is another case where schools are suffering the consequences of societal decisions, right? So we have made the choice not to invest in closing the digital divide. We, some people refer to it as the homework gap, but we knew about this
Yeah.
before COVID. It's just that COVID has made the put the consequences of it into sharper relief,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So the Pew did a research study on home internet access and showed that about 79% of white families have reliable internet access, 66% of African American families, 61% of Latino families.
Mm,
So those gaps in internet access then translated into some students literally having the schoolhouse door barred for them last spring because they couldn't get online,
right.
right? And it's in high needs rural communities, it is a problem of access, but it often in some communities, particularly some of our high needs urban and suburban communities, it's a question of cable company policies. We have cable companies that say, well, if you have an unpaid balance, we won't turn on your internet. Well, the result is that's a kid who doesn't have the opportunity to learn. Now, we could invest the resources, and certainly some school districts are giving out a lot of hotspots. Some districts have even built towers themselves. Some districts are putting Wi-Fi hotspots on buses, on the school buses, and parking them strategically so that kids can access Wi-Fi. But really, as a society, what we should have said is, just as in the New Deal, we had the realization that we had to have the Tennessee Valley Authority and we had to make sure everyone had access to electricity. We should have said, well, everyone needs the internet, so we're going to make sure the internet is available for all students and families so they can participate. So just internet access is a challenge, but then we also have a device challenge. And there are places around the country that used to ask the question, is there a device in the home? But what we know from this spring is that's not really the question. The question is there a device for each child in the home to simultaneously be doing their schoolwork? And we still have kids who are relying on a phone to try to, download some of their work from school. We got to invest in devices. Now, I am hopeful. Congress is working on another stimulus bill. I'm hopeful in the next couple of weeks here that we will see another stimulus bill and that there'll be dedicated resources. I have a piece in Ed Week today, actually, one of the FCC commissioners arguing that Congress ought to prioritize resources for the E-rate program and expanding the E-rate program to
Right.
make it easier for schools to get internet service to families. So there are some tangible things we could do, but we need policymakers to do them. At the school level, getting hotspots to kids obviously is the right thing. Getting devices out to kids is the right thing. Surveying families on their internet and device access so you know what the needs are, that's critical. But we at the federal level, I think, have a responsibility to get more resources to you and others on the ground
Mhm.
to get kids the support they need.
Right. Very good. Very good. I want to go right into this next one, which is about the declarative statements. Um, uh, just a couple of months ago, or a few weeks ago, everybody was on board. Districts, corporations, nonprofits, everybody on board making these declarative statements about um, racial divide or equity or prejudice. And they were emphatic that we're not going to stand for this. We are who we are. We will not have that. A zero tolerance policy, right? You heard it. You heard it
Mm-hmm,
multiple times across the
mm-hmm,
country.
mm-hmm,
So I'm wondering, how do we hold them accountable to that?
mm-hmm.
Um, it's easier said than done, right?
That's right.
You can say but you said this. Yeah, yeah, we're gonna get to that, right? We're gonna push it
Mm-hmm.
right to the side, and we'll get to that old equity thing, right?
Yeah.
So I don't want to lose sight of that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to continue to push my colleagues in that, and those districts, those district leaders who made those declarations. We have to hold them accountable. You just said equity is a part uh, of our life. We can't just put it on agenda or time it out. It's a part of us folding into our everyday
Mm-hmm.
life and everyday
Mm-hmm.
living. And the declarative statements are a way for us to do that. Weigh in on that. Talk about ways that we could do that.
Well, I think you're exactly right. We have to hold folks to the statement, and we have to ask what are the substantive changes that are
Hmm.
flowing from those statements. I was at an event recently, um, and I followed Reverend Barber from the Poor People's Campaign.
Yes.
And Reverend Barber said, I'm glad we're changing statues, but we also need to keep our eye focused on changing statutes. Right,
Yes.
and his point was that symbolism is good and important, but what we need is substantive change. And so, to me, the question is how will we ask people, whether it's quarterly or more frequent, to report on at the district level, at the foundation level, at the business level, at the higher ed institution level, what have you done to make real these work? So, I'll give you an example. We did a report last week at the Education Trust, the title of which was "Segregation Forever?" question mark.
Hmm.
And the report tells the story of selective admission public colleges around the country. And what we show is there is not a single state where the selective admission public colleges serve the same percentage of Black and Latino students as there are Black and Latino folks 18 to 24 in their state. Not a single state. And in fact, in a majority of cases, the percentage of Black students today is lower than it was 20 years ago. So we're heading in the wrong direction in a lot of places. And so to me, and a lot of those institutions put out these statements of solidarity with the protesters. They said Black Lives Matter. But to me, those words ring hollow if you aren't even admitting students of color. If you're not hiring faculty of color, the words ring hollow. If your campus climate is not supportive of students of color, your words ring hollow. And so I think we have to ask people uh, to account for their doing. And that may mean that we have to put that protest energy that we've put into issues of policing into other issues like voting, like education investment and education funding, um, like the decisions that school districts are making around student discipline, for example, or the decisions that higher ed institutions are making about admissions policy.
I would be absolutely remiss if we didn't talk about student loans, the student loan crisis.
Mm, mm,
Very important to educators. Very
mm.
important.
Mm-hmm.
Familiar with TFA that came along where, we will cover the expense, their practices and how you give and take somewhat kind of situation. And, I feel like COVID kind of has exacerbated this whole idea
Oh yeah.
of, the need to pay off this debt. And yeah, I can't get ahead. I was already struggling. And so I do know that it has been perceived as a radical proposal. Like, what do you mean? Stopping student loan debt or giving some kind of um, um, relief around the student loan debt. I know that you went before the House Education Committee to talk about this issue. Where are we on that issue? How can we work to be lobbyists?
Yes.
No more of us just sitting idly by. These are issues that affect principals, they affect assistant principals and teachers and campus level leaders. How can we be a part of that? You just talked about putting the protest energy in other areas. This is a
Mm-hmm.
great opportunity to do just that.
That's right.
Pick up that sign and that energy and do it in a very different way. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, what's the current state of that
Yeah.
proposal
Yeah.
and what could we do?
Yeah. Well, there's sort of two pieces. One is we have to fundamentally address college affordability, particularly for low-income students. Now, low-income students primarily rely on Pell Grants
Hmm.
to pay for school. That's the primary federal vehicle to get support to students. In 1980, um, Pell Grants accounted for almost 80% of the cost of a public four-year college.
Hmm.
Today, Pell Grants account for about 28% of the cost. And what's happened over that period is we've shifted from the government helping to subsidize to people borrowing. And so we are seeing now the consequences of the failure to invest in the Pell Grant program. So in the short term, one immediate thing we should do is we should double Pell Grant so that we can start to restore the buying power, if you will, of Pell Grants. That will make college more affordable. But then we've got to look at the folks who have debt, and we've got to help people. And the reality is, this is deeply tied to our racial wealth gap. Black students are more likely to borrow, are more likely to borrow more, and are more likely to default. And if we want to address, again, to this earlier point about the statements of solidarity, if we want to address the racial wealth gap, we have to take on not only the broad issue of student debt, but in particular, Black student debt. Now, there are proposals to try to have some debt forgiveness as part of the COVID relief, proposals for $10,000 uh, per person below a certain income threshold, some proposals even at $20,000 per person below a certain income threshold. Uh, I think it's important that we do that to try to make up for our failure over the last 40 years to invest adequately in Pell Grants. Right? People have that debt because we didn't do what we should have done in public policy over the last 40 years. So we both need to correct for that mistake over the last 40 years, and we got to correct for it going forward by doubling, at least doubling Pell Grant. Um, so this is a huge challenge for the country, and it's the wealthiest country in the world, right? This is all about choices and what we choose to invest in. And if we want to be a society that is about social mobility and access to opportunity, then we have to make college affordable for everyone.
All right, so it's back to school. You're in front of your staff. Okay. Everybody's there. You've got your APs, you've got your instructional coaches, teachers, your cafeteria support staff, your building engineering staff. Everybody's there. You know these people to be warriors, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, you've had great success. Then here comes the national public, the global public pandemic. They feel broken. They feel tired. They've got a
Mhm.
ton of other things on their mind. What do you say? What do you say to them to inspire hope, to encourage them to, be firm or be resilient, to
Mhm.
advance
Mhm. Mhm.
in spite of adversity, when they feel like their tools are just worn out?
Yeah.
What do you say?
Well, two things. Uh, One, I'd have a pre-reading, and the pre-reading would be the column that John Lewis wrote just a few days before he passed, that was published on the day of his funeral last week in the New York Times. And what you see in that column is facing death at the end of his life. John Lewis is so clear about the sacred nature of our struggle to build the beloved community, and so clear about the level of inspiration that he drew from the young people who were protesting around issues of policing and criminal justice. So clear about uh, his hope that despite all of our struggles, we can get to a better place as a country. And you think about what it is to spend your whole life in the struggle for civil rights, meeting tremendous resistance, sacrificing his body, being
Yes,
beaten,
yes,
right, for a set of principles around equality and democracy. And to come to the end of your life and still be laser focused on the hope of what is possible and a vision that we haven't gotten there yet, but that we will get there through the perseverance and the organizing and the ballot, right? That hope and confidence and resolve that he exhibited, that should be an inspiration to us all. So that'd be the first thing. Is we should all read that and draw inspiration from his life. And the second thing I would say is, at the end of the day, school is about teachers and students, the relationship between them and the work in which they are engaged. And that relationship is so central, so transformative. For some kids, even when schools were closed, it was that morning meeting on Zoom where the kids would just light up because that was the one moment where they saw their teacher and they saw their friends,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
What a tremendous gift that is to be able to be a part of that,
yeah.
right? And so we have to find a way to prioritize those relationships, that connection with every student. And through the COVID-19 pandemic, through the pandemic of systemic racism, at the end of the day, the thing we can do as educators is build those relationships with kids and engage them in the joy of learning. And that's why we got into the work. That is what brings us satisfaction in the work, and that is where we've got to focus our energy going forward, even with all the politics around us and distractions around us. At the end of the day, relationship between teachers and students and the work in which they're.
So we are just wrapping things up, and I was I went through public school my entire life. I know so did you. I know your daughters are in public school. So are my children.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to end with this. I can't imagine giving up on public school. I can't imagine it. Many of my colleagues, um, their children, they don't go to public schools where they serve. Um, no judgment here. You know, it's you have a choice. but I always argue and stand for public school.
Mhm.
And so I want to end with this. Those who are perhaps straddling the fence, those who have already made a decision, of course it's their choice. But I always try to slide in a little something or drop a seed to encourage them to not give up on public school. Do you have a thought about that as we close?
Yeah, look, I think um, obviously every family needs to do what's right for
Of
their
course, of
children,
course.
but public education is the foundation of our democracy. It is the place where we not only learn skills and gain knowledge, but it's a place where we practice civic life, where we learn to be a part of a community and to hopefully leave that community better than we found it, right? And that role of public education is so vital, and we need everyone to be supportive of that. We need everyone to invest in that if we want to preserve our democracy in the long run. And so I hope people will, when they're making decisions about voting, when they're making decisions about uh, kind of the priorities of their community, of their state, that they will put public education at the top because that is how we um, preserve our long-term prosperity and our democracy. Every business, every business leader I meet with says, what I really need is a well-prepared future workforce. Well, that's going to happen in public school,
That's right.
right? Um, so we have to as a society um, prioritize public education.
Agreed. I am grateful. Thanks for taking time.
Oh, thank you.
I appreciate it. I am going to share this with everybody that I know to encourage this work and to really get us off to a very exciting year. I know that you're crazy busy, but I appreciate you taking time to talk with
Thanks.
me. And listen, I sent over some exciting treats. I sent them to Tia, and
Oh, that's so nice.
I made her pinky swear that you guys would put your shirts on and take a funny picture, hold up the peace sign or something, and
Okay.
shout out.
All right. All right. All right. Done.
So
We'll
please
do
be
that.
sure that you get
Okay.
this. She's going to get it to you next week, and so I
Okay.
look forward to it. Have a
All
great day.
right.
We'll talk
All
soon.
right. You too.